Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. As you can see, we're in a slightly different setup today. We're in our studio, so we've got loads of really good content coming up. If you haven't seen some of the content already recorded in the studio, do check them out. So let's see, the first comment today is from Free Speech is Best. If Muhammad was such a great abolisher of slavery, why was slavery so integral to the Islamic Empire's economy for more than a millennia after his death? Slave markets could be found in Medina and in Mecca. Saudi Arabia abolished slavery in 1962 only after intense international pressure to do so. Okay, so this comment was in reference to the Islam and slavery video. So if you haven't seen that, do check that out. There's been a few similar comments in line with this, that basically Muslims practice slavery for a period of time afterwards. So the fact that Islam is against slavery can't be true. That's basically how a lot of the comments are with regards to this particular issue. Now, I can only really present Islam's position from the primary sources with regards to this issue. And I presented them in the video, specifically showing that Islam doesn't support slavery. And actually, through the practice of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and through the Quran, it basically is against slavery and tries to abolish slavery. That's what I talked about in the video. This wasn't a discussion about individual countries and what their practices were. It wasn't a discussion why, for example, as was raised in this comment, why Saudi Arabia didn't actually ratify the anti-slavery bill, and it was only in 1962 that they did this. It wasn't a video targeting these particular countries and talking about what their reasons and justifications for continuing slavery were. It was a video looking at the primary sources, as I've mentioned. Just as another point, lots of people think that Saudi Arabia, because they contain Mecca and Medina, they represent Islam or the entire Muslim population, basically, in terms of the general opinion of Muslims across the world. But Saudi Arabia doesn't represent Islam or the entire Muslim world, in terms of opinions regarding these things, despite having Mecca and Medina in its borders. So I think it's an easy mistake to make because Mecca and Medina are in the borders of Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia doesn't represent Islam and it doesn't represent the majority of Muslim scholarship. So I wouldn't use them as an example to show that Islam in any way, shape or form would support slavery or any other opinion, to be honest. So from X Born Again, just tell me, how many slaves did Muhammad own? Okay, so this is in response to the Islam and slavery video that we recorded a while back now. So Muhammad, peace be upon him, didn't actually own any slaves. So I'll just mention a couple of instances and just clarify a few things. So the first instance, which is often misunderstood, is the issue of Khadija's slaves. When the Prophet first married, he married a woman called Khadija. And she was a very successful businesswoman. She was very wealthy. And when they got married, she basically gave all of her wealth over to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Part of the wealth was basically slaves as well. Upon him getting this wealth from her, he freed all of the slaves that came into his possession at that time. So he didn't own any slaves from her at all, as they were all freed once they got married. The other issue is one that's often misconstrued as well, is the story of Zayd ibn Haritha. So he was one of the slaves that was gifted to Khadija, the first wife of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Zayd, he was a young boy at the time, and as we've already stated, when they got married and Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, freed all the slaves, Zayd remained in the household with Muhammad for a long time after that. But when Zayd's family actually came to find Zayd and take him back with them, Muhammad gave the choice to Zayd whether he wanted to stay with Muhammad in the household where he was staying or whether he wanted to go back with his family. And he was absolutely free to go and be with his family and his relatives without any ransom or charge or anything like that. The Prophet, peace be upon him, was very clear about that. He was free to go and do as he pleased. And actually Zayd, which I mentioned in the video, Zayd was very adamant that he wanted to stay with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, at which point Muhammad, peace be upon him, took him to publicly state by the Kaaba and announced his adoption of Zayd publicly. So he wasn't a slave basically, but he remained under the household of the Prophet for a long time thereafter with him. Okay, so the next issue that's often misconstrued or misunderstood was the case of Maria Al-QIBTIYYA. She is often touted or mentioned in references as being a Coptic slave gifted via an emissary from Egypt in order to increase ties with Muhammad, peace be upon him. But this can't be the case that she was a slave, simply because of the fact that in order to increase ties between nations, even in Europe actually, this was a common practice between royal families of nations within Europe. What would often happen was they would arrange marriages amongst the royal families, and they would arrange marriages between men and women who were of high rank, basically, or princes, princesses, etc. So the case is similar in this situation. So in order to increase ties between nations, you would send noble men or noble women in marriage to nations in order to increase ties that way. So this is the same situation. Egypt at the time sent Maria Al-QIBTIYYA to increase ties with Muhammad, peace be upon him, and they married. So she was a woman of high standing. She wouldn't have been a slave as such, because you don't send slaves or those who would have been considered at the time lower in social ranking to increase ties between nations. That doesn't make sense. She was also known as one of the mothers of the believers. So she had exactly the same rank as the other wives of the Prophet, peace be upon him, who were all given the title of mothers of the believers. So it couldn't be the case that she was also a slave, basically. And the last point, which is also very commonly misunderstood, is the case of BARAKAH bint Thalaba. She's also known as Ayman, commonly within Arabic literature. She was an Abyssinian slave of the Prophet's parents, and when the Prophet's mother died, Ayman was really pivotal in raising Muhammad, peace be upon him, after his own mother had passed away. And Muhammad, peace be upon him, actually later freed her and arranged both her marriages. He actually continued to call her Ummi in Arabic, which means my mother. So she's clearly not a slave, and it was clearly documented that he had freed her as well. So there shouldn't be any misunderstanding of the case of Ayman, basically. Okay, straight into the next comment. Thunder Witch. Okay, what is the point of the contract if after the war ends, the prisoners just get to leave? Okay, so this comment was in response to the prisoners of war video and basically Islam's stance on the prisoners of war. So if you haven't watched that, I definitely recommend you go and check it out. The reason why it's important to have the contract, otherwise known in Arabic, mukataba. So just to briefly summarize it, so mukataba is a contract which a slave or a prisoner of war can open with their carer or their master to basically work towards their freedom. And it's open to anyone, regardless of their age or gender or anything like that. So a prisoner of war or a slave can start a contract or this mukataba to get out of their situation. The reason why that's important to still have, in the case of a war, is because, as we all know, even in international law at the moment, once a war finishes, prisoners of war should all be released. And that was the case in Islam as well. So once a war ends, the prisoners get to leave. So what's the point in the contract if you can just be set free once the war ends? Why don't you just bide your time? That's basically what Thunder Witch is asking. So the reason why the contract is important is because you don't know how long the war is going to last for. Okay, so World War I went on for about 4 years. World War II went on for about 6 years or so. The Vietnam War lasted for 20 years. Okay, the war in Afghanistan lasted for 20 years before the foreign forces withdrew. So you don't know how long a war is going to last for at the end of the day. You can never suppose a war will be short-lived. So the contract, or the mukataba, is there to allow the prisoner of war to start the process of freedom before the war ends, essentially. And, after a war ends, you don't keep prisoners of war indefinitely, as I already mentioned, and that's a recognized international practice, when wars end. And that's in order to start the process of reconciliation between countries and a return back to normality, essentially. So that was a brief kind of run into a few of the comments that you guys have mentioned on some of the videos. So I'm really grateful that you guys are interacting with us through the channel and commenting down below and liking or disliking the videos as well. It's good to get into a conversation, discussion about some of these issues that can be quite controversial. So please do keep commenting. If you have any questions, just add them under the videos. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video. So take care. Peace be upon you.